A 1912 wedding photo looks peaceful, but zoom in on the bride's hand. In April 2024, Emily Harrison, a curator at the Philadelphia Museum of History, was cataloging a recently acquired collection of early 20th century photographs donated by the estate of Dorothy Mitchell, a local historian who had passed away at age 92. The collection contained hundreds of images documenting life in Philadelphia between 1900 and 1930, street scenes, family gatherings, business establishments, and various social events that provided valuable glimpses into the city's past. Among the standard portraits and group photographs, one wedding picture from 1912 immediately captured Emily's attention, though she couldn't initially articulate why. The image showed a formal wedding party posed on the steps of what appeared to be a church. The bride and groom stood in the center, surrounded by bridesmaids in pale dresses and groomsmen in dark suits. Everything about the composition seemed entirely typical for the period. The formal poses, the elaborate Victorian Gothic architecture in the background, the careful arrangement of the wedding party in descending rows on the stone steps. But something nagged at Emily's professional instincts, a subtle wrongness that made her set the photograph aside for closer examination. Rather than simply cataloging it and moving on to the next image, she brought the photograph to her workstation and placed it under a magnifying glass, scanning the faces of the wedding party. The groom appeared to be in his early 30s, with a thick mustache and confident bearing, typical of successful young men of that era. The bridesmaids smiled appropriately, their expressions showing the reserved happiness expected at formal occasions. The groomsmen maintained the serious, dignified demeanor that photography conventions of the time demanded, but the bride's face was different. Emily leaned closer, studying the young woman's expression with growing concern. Her smile was fixed, almost rigid, and didn't reach her eyes. There was something in those eyes, a flatness, a distance, perhaps even fear, that seemed jarring in what should have been a joyful moment. The bride's posture was stiff, her shoulders held in a way that suggested tension rather than the relaxed happiness of a woman on her wedding day. Then Emily noticed the hands. The groom's hand rested possessively on the bride's waist, clearly visible in the photograph. But the bride's hands were positioned strangely, one clutching a large bouquet of flowers so tightly that Emily could see the tension even in the old photograph, and the other hand, Emily adjusted the magnifying glass, bringing the image into sharper focus. The bride's left hand hung at her side, partially hidden by the folds of her elaborate wedding dress, but enough was visible to see something deeply disturbing. The hand was positioned at an unnatural angle, and even through the limitations of 1912 photography, Emily could see what appeared to be significant bruising around the wrist, dark marks that the long lace sleeves of the wedding gown couldn't quite conceal. Emily's heart rate increased as she transferred the photograph to the museum's digital scanning equipment, a sophisticated system capable of capturing extraordinary detail from historical images and revealing information invisible to the unaided eye. She carefully positioned the photograph on the scanner bed, adjusting the settings to maximum resolution and ensuring the lighting was optimal for capturing every nuance of the century-old image. The scan took several minutes to complete, during which Emily found herself holding her breath, already suspecting what enhanced magnification might reveal, but hoping somehow that she was wrong, that her initial observation had been mistaken or exaggerated by the play of light and shadow in an old photograph. When the high-resolution image appeared on her computer screen, Emily enlarged it to focus specifically on the bride's visible left hand. At this magnification level, the details were undeniable and profoundly disturbing. The bruising around her wrist was extensive, dark, finger-shaped marks that formed a clear pattern consistent with someone having grabbed her forcefully, violently. The bruising appeared relatively fresh, perhaps only days old when the photograph was taken, the discoloration still dark and pronounced rather than the yellowing of older injuries. Emily shifted her focus to other parts of the image, examining every visible inch of the bride's body for additional signs of trauma. The high neckline of the wedding dress made it impossible to see her throat or upper chest, but Emily noticed other troubling details. The bride's right hand, the one clutching the bouquet, showed similar, though less pronounced, bruising on the fingers, as if she had tried to defend herself or had gripped something desperately. There were also faint marks visible along her collarbone where the lace of her dress became semi-transparent in the photograph. More bruising, carefully concealed but not quite hidden by the elaborate gown and the strategic positioning of her veil. Emily zoomed in on the bride's face, studying her expression with the enhanced clarity the digital scan provided. What she had initially perceived as a fixed smile now revealed itself as something more complex and heartbreaking. The young woman's jaw was clenched with visible tension. Her eyes, though looking directly at the camera as convention required, showed a haunting emptiness. Not the nervousness of a young bride or the solemn formality of Victorian photography, but something that looked disturbingly like resignation or even despair. The groom's hand on her waist, Emily now noticed, wasn't resting there gently. His fingers pressed into her side with enough force to create visible indentations in the fabric of her dress. His own expression, which Emily had initially read as confidence, now seemed more like possessiveness or control. There was something in his eyes, a hardness, a coldness, that made Emily instinctively uncomfortable even across the distance of 112 years. She turned her attention to the other people in the photograph, wondering if anyone else showed signs of noticing or reacting to what was clearly a troubling situation. Emily systematically examined each person in the wedding party, looking for reactions, for any indication that someone had noticed the bride's distress or the visible signs of violence on her body. The results were both revealing and deeply disturbing in their implications about what people in 1912 were willing to overlook or ignore. The 4 bridesmaids, arranged in 2 pairs on either side of the bride and groom, showed varying reactions. 2 of them, the ones positioned farthest from the bride, smiled pleasantly, apparently unaware of anything amiss or successfully maintaining the facade that wedding photography required. But the 2 bridesmaids, standing immediately adjacent to the bride, told a different story entirely. The woman to the bride's immediate left, who appeared to be roughly the same age, perhaps a sister or close friend, had an expression Emily recognized from her years studying historical photographs, the carefully neutral face of someone trying desperately not to reveal their true emotions. Her smile was forced, her eyes were troubled, and, most tellingly, she was positioned slightly away from the bride, as if maintaining physical distance despite the photographer's likely instructions to stand close together. Emily noticed that this bridesmaid's hand, visible at her side, was clenched into a tight fist, a detail that suggested anger, frustration, or perhaps helpless awareness of a terrible situation she felt powerless to change. The bridesmaid on the other side showed similar signs of discomfort. Her gaze wasn't directed at the camera, but rather at the groom, and even through the grainy quality of early 20th century photography, Emily could detect what looked like obvious disapproval or even disgust in her expression. This woman was older than the bride, perhaps in her late 30s, and carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to social authority, possibly a married woman, a relative, someone whose opinion should have carried weight. The groomsmen were more difficult to read, their faces showing the typical masculine stoicism expected of men in formal photographs of that era. But Emily noticed that 2 of them were positioned unusually far from the groom, leaving awkward gaps in what should have been a symmetrical composition. One groomsman, a younger man who might have been the groom's brother or close friend based on the family resemblance, stood with his arms crossed, a defensive closed-off posture that seemed inappropriate for a wedding photograph and suggested his own discomfort with the proceedings. Behind the main wedding party, partially visible in the background, stood what appeared to be family members and wedding guests. Emily enlarged this section of the photograph, studying the faces of the observers. An elderly woman, dressed in the heavy black clothing typical of widows of that era, stood near the church entrance with an expression of profound sadness that seemed excessive, even for someone of her generation, known for their somber demeanors in photographs. Her hand was raised to her face in a gesture that suggested she might have been weeping or was deeply distressed. Emily knew that identifying the people in the photograph would be crucial to understanding the story behind those terrible bruises and that haunted expression. She began with the most obvious identifying feature, the church itself. The Victorian Gothic architecture visible in the background was distinctive, with particular details that might help narrow down the location, elaborate stone carvings around the entrance, a specific style of pointed arch windows, and what appeared to be a cornerstone with carved text, though it was too distant and blurry to read clearly in the photograph. She spent the next several hours researching churches in Philadelphia that had been standing in 1912 and matched the architectural style visible in the image. Philadelphia had dozens of historic churches, but the combination of specific architectural elements, particularly the distinctive window tracery and the carved stone gargoyles barely visible along the roofline, eventually led her to St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Center City, a prominent congregation that had served Philadelphia's wealthy elite since the 1850s. Armed with this location, Emily contacted St. Mark's directly, explaining that she was a museum curator, researching a historical photograph that appeared to have been taken on their church steps. The church secretary, an enthusiastic volunteer named Margaret who clearly loved the church's history, was thrilled to help and immediately offered Emily access to their archives. 2 days later, Emily sat in a small office in the church basement, surrounded by leather-bound ledgers containing records of every wedding, baptism, and funeral conducted at St. Mark's since its founding. The wedding registers were organized chronologically, with entries noting the date, the names of the couple being married, the officiating clergy, and often additional details about the ceremony and the families involved. Emily focused on the year 1912, scanning through entries month by month. Spring and early summer were popular wedding seasons, and she examined April through June carefully, looking for any weddings that seemed significant enough to warrant the elaborate formal photography visible in the picture, the kind of wedding that would have involved multiple bridesmaids, groomsmen, and substantial family presence. On a page, dated May 18, 1912, she found an entry that made her pulse quicken. Marriage solemnized between Mr. Robert Harrison, age 32 of Philadelphia, and Miss Clara Bennett, age 19 of Philadelphia. Ceremony performed by Reverend Thomas Whitfield. Witnesses, Mr. James Harrison, brother of groom, Miss Elizabeth Bennett, sister of bride, and 6 additional members of the wedding party. Reception held at the Harrison family residence, 1840 Rittenhouse Square. The names meant nothing to Emily initially, but several details aligned perfectly with the photograph. The bride's young age, only 19, was consistent with her appearance in the image. The Rittenhouse Square address indicated significant wealth, the kind of family that would have commissioned professional wedding photography, still a luxury in 1912. Emily immediately began researching the Harrison and Bennett families using the Philadelphia Historical Society's extensive genealogical databases and the digitized archives of the city's major newspapers. What she discovered over the next several days painted a troubling picture of wealth, social pressure, and violence hidden behind the facade of respectable society. Robert Harrison came from one of Philadelphia's most prominent families. His father, Jonathan Harrison, had made an enormous fortune in steel manufacturing during the industrial boom of the late 19th century, expanding the family business into railroads and real estate. By 1912, the Harrisons were among the wealthiest families in Pennsylvania, with a mansion on Rittenhouse Square, a summer estate in the countryside, and extensive social connections to other elite families. Robert himself had been groomed from birth to take over the family business empire. He had attended the finest private schools, graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, and by age 30 had already assumed significant control of Harrison Industries, while his aging father gradually retired from active management. Newspaper Society. Pages from the period describe Robert as a commanding presence in Philadelphia business circles and a most eligible bachelor before his marriage. But Emily also found darker hints in the historical record. A brief article from 1909 mentioned Robert Harrison being involved in an altercation at his gentleman's club that resulted in another member requiring medical attention, though charges were never filed, and the incident was described as a regrettable misunderstanding between friends. Another article from 1911 mentioned a lawsuit filed by a former household servant against the Harrison family, alleging cruel treatment and wrongful dismissal, though the case had been settled out of court with no details made public. Clara Bennett's background was quite different. Her family was respectable but not wealthy. Her father, Thomas Bennett, was a clerk at a downtown bank, a position that provided middle-class comfort but nothing approaching the Harrison family's extraordinary wealth. Clara had 3 siblings, 2 sisters and a brother. She had attended a local girls' academy and, according to a brief society page mention from 1910, had been noted for her beauty and gentle disposition during her debut into Philadelphia society at age 17. The engagement between Robert Harrison and Clara Bennett had been announced in February 1912, just 3 months before the wedding. The newspaper announcement described it as a most favorable match and noted that the union would join 2 respected Philadelphia families. Reading between the lines of the formal Victorian language, Emily suspected this had been an arranged marriage, or at least one heavily promoted by both families, the Bennetts gaining social elevation and financial security through connection to the wealthy Harrisons, and the Harrisons gaining a young, beautiful, socially appropriate bride for their heir. Emily continued her research, moving through newspaper archives month by month after the May 1912 wedding, looking for any mention of the Harrison marriage or Clara Harrison herself. For the first several months, she found only the expected society page mentions. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Harrison attended the charity ball at, and Mrs. Robert Harrison wore an elegant gown of, the standard documentation of wealthy society life, all surface appearances with no hint of what might be happening behind closed doors. But in November 1912, just 6 months after the wedding, Emily found something that made her breath catch. A brief article buried on page 7 of the Philadelphia Inquirer, easy to miss among advertisements and minor news items. Mrs. Clara Harrison, wife of prominent businessman Robert Harrison, was treated at Pennsylvania Hospital yesterday afternoon for injuries sustained in what family representatives described as an unfortunate accident in the home. Mrs. Harrison reportedly fell down a staircase at the Harrison residence on Rittenhouse Square. She was released after treatment and has returned home to recover. Mr. Harrison expressed his deep concern for his wife's well-being and gratitude to the attending physicians. A fall down the stairs. Emily had studied enough historical cases of domestic violence to recognize this as one of the most common explanations given to explain away injuries inflicted by abusive husbands. The Victorian and Edwardian eras were rife with such stories, women falling or having accidents with suspicious frequency, their injuries explained away by family members and doctors who either genuinely believed the stories or were complicit in maintaining the fiction to protect the reputations of prominent families. Emily searched for additional mentions of Clara Harrison over the following months and years. What emerged was a heartbreaking pattern. In March 1913, another brief mention of Clara being treated for a sprained wrist sustained while gardening. In August 1913, a notice that Mrs. Harrison had retired to the family's country estate for an extended rest due to nervous exhaustion, the Victorian euphemism for what might have been depression, trauma, or an attempt to escape her husband's violence. Society page mentions of Clara appearing at events became less frequent after the first year of marriage. When she was mentioned, the description sometimes included odd details. Mrs. Harrison wore an elegant high-necked gown, in summer when such clothing would have been uncomfortably warm, perhaps hiding bruises on her throat. Or Mrs. Harrison, who has been in delicate health, made a brief appearance before retiring early. In January 1914, Emily found an article that made her hands tremble as she read, "Philadelphia Society mourns young Mrs." Harrison. Clara Bennett. Harrison, beloved wife of Robert Harrison, passed away on January 15, 1914 at the family residence. She was 21 years old. The cause of death was reported as pneumonia following a prolonged illness. Mrs. Harrison is survived by her husband, her parents Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Bennett, and 3 siblings. Funeral services will be held privately. 21 years old. Dead less than 2 years after that wedding photograph was taken, less than 2 years after she stood on those church steps with bruises on her wrists and terror in her eyes. Emily knew she needed to see Clara Harrison's death certificate and any available medical records from her hospitalizations. Death certificates from 1914 were public records, maintained by the Pennsylvania Department of Health and available to researchers. She submitted a formal request and received the scanned document 3 days later. The certificate was brief and formal. Clara Bennett Harrison, female, white, age 21 years. Date of death, January 15th, 1914. Place of death, 1840, Rittenhouse Square, Philadelphia. Cause of death, pneumonia with complications. Contributing factors, general debility and weakened constitution. Attending physician, Dr. Harold Whitmore. Informant, Robert Harrison, husband. Pneumonia was common in 1914, before antibiotics, and could certainly be fatal, especially in someone whose immune system was compromised by other health issues. But the phrase general debility and weakened constitution caught Emily's attention. What had caused this weakened constitution in a woman who should have been in the prime of health? Emily reached out to Dr. James Mitchell, a colleague who specialized in historical medical practices and had access to archived hospital records from Philadelphia's major medical institutions. She explained her research and asked if he could locate any records from Clara Harrison's hospital visits in 1912 and 1913. A week later, Dr. Mitchell called Emily with disturbing news. He had found admission records from Pennsylvania Hospital for 3 separate visits by Clara Harrison, far more than the single newspaper mention had suggested. The medical notes, written in the formal clinical language of the era, documented injuries that were clearly inconsistent with the explanations provided. First admission, November 1912, Dr. Mitchell read over the phone. Patient presented with contusions to the face and torso, fractured rib on the left side, and significant bruising to the arms. Patient claimed to have fallen down a staircase. Examining physician, Dr. Robert Sterling, noted in his private observations, these are separate notes not included in the official record, that the pattern of injuries was inconsistent with a simple fall and more suggestive of assault. However, the patient insisted on the accident explanation, and her husband, Mr. Robert Harrison, was quite forceful in his insistence that no further questions be asked. Emily felt sick as Dr. Mitchell continued reading from the historical medical records. Second admission, March 1913. Patient presented with a severely sprained wrist, extensive bruising to the forearm, and what the examining physician described as defensive wounds on the hands consistent with attempting to ward off blows. The official diagnosis was sprain from gardening accident, but the same Dr. Sterling made another private notation expressing his strong suspicion that the patient was the victim of ongoing domestic violence. And the third admission? Emily asked, though she almost didn't want to know. September 1913. This was the most serious. Patient presented unconscious, having been brought in by her husband, who claimed she had fainted. Examination revealed a concussion, significant bruising to the throat, consistent with strangulation, and evidence of broken blood vessels in the eyes, again consistent with strangulation or severe compression of the neck. Dr. Mitchell had more information to share, information that Emily found both heartbreaking and infuriating. The hospital archives also contained Dr. Sterling's personal journal from that period. Physicians often kept private journals recording their observations and concerns about cases, separate from official medical records. Dr. Sterling wrote extensively about Clara Harrison's case because it clearly troubled him deeply. Dr. Mitchell had photographed the relevant journal pages and sent them to Emily's email. She opened the images on her computer, struggling to read the physician's handwriting from 1913. November 20th, 1912. Treated Mrs. Clara Harrison today for injuries she claims resulted from a fall downstairs. I do not believe this explanation. I have been a physician for 23 years and have treated countless victims of falls, accidents, and misfortune. The injuries this young woman sustained show a pattern consistent with violent assault, multiple impacts from different angles, defensive wounds where she clearly tried to protect herself, bruising on her arms and the distinctive shape of fingers where someone grabbed her. When I attempted to question her privately, away from her husband's presence, she became visibly frightened and insisted her story was true. Her husband, Mr. Robert Harrison, is a man of considerable wealth and influence in this city. I am ashamed to admit that I allowed myself to be intimidated by his position and his forceful personality. I documented only what I was permitted to document. I have failed this young woman in my oath as a physician. Emily read on, finding more entries about Clara over the following months. March 15th, 1913. Mrs. Clara Harrison returned to the hospital today. Once again, injuries inconsistent with her explanation. Once again, I said nothing, did nothing to truly help her. The husband stands over her like a guard, controlling every word she speaks to medical staff. I can see the fear in her eyes, the desperate plea for help that she cannot voice. What can I do? If I report my suspicions to the authorities, who will believe a physician's concerns over the word of Robert Harrison, one of Philadelphia's most prominent citizens? If I push too hard, I will simply be removed from her care, replaced by a physician more willing to look the other way, and she will have no one who even acknowledges the truth of her situation. September 8th, 1913. Today, I genuinely feared for Mrs. Harrison's life. The injuries I treated were severe, a concussion, evidence of strangulation. If her husband continues this pattern, he will eventually kill her. I attempted to speak with her mother, Mrs. Thomas Bennett, who was present during this hospital visit. I tried to convey my concerns discreetly, suggesting that Mrs. Harrison might benefit from an extended stay with her family, away from her husband. Mrs. Bennett looked at me with such sadness and said only, "Dr. Sterling, you don't understand how these things work in families like theirs. There is nothing we can do." I pressed her, saying that her daughter's life might be at risk. She replied, "Clara made her choice when she married him. We all must live with the consequences of our choices." I was appalled by this response. Dr. Sterling's journal continued with entries from the final months of Clara's life, documenting his growing frustration, guilt, and sense of helplessness as he watched a young woman being slowly destroyed by domestic violence while feeling powerless to intervene due to social conventions, class dynamics, and the lack of legal protections for married women in that era. December 10th, 1913. I encountered Mrs. Harrison at a social function this evening, a charity event where I served on the organizing committee. She appeared thin, almost frail, and carried herself with the defeated posture of someone who has given up hope. Her husband remained at her side constantly, his hand on her arm in a gesture that appeared affectionate to other guests, but which I recognized as controlling and possessive. At one point in the evening, she accidentally bumped into a waiter, causing him to spill wine on her dress. The look of terror that crossed her face in that moment, fear of her husband's reaction to this minor incident, was heartbreaking to witness. I saw Mr. Harrison grip her arm tightly and lead her away from the crowd, speaking to her in low, harsh tones that I could not hear, but whose meaning was clear from his expression and her cowering response. January 3rd, 1914. I was called to the Harrison residence today to attend to Mrs. Harrison, who has developed a serious respiratory infection. What I found alarmed me greatly. The young woman is severely underweight, clearly malnourished, despite living in a household of extraordinary wealth. She has lost perhaps 20 pounds since I first treated her in 1912, and her physical condition has deteriorated dramatically. The pneumonia she has developed is serious, but I'm more concerned about her overall weakened state. She seems to have lost the will to fight, to recover, perhaps even to live. I tried to insist she be hospitalized for proper treatment, but Mr. Harrison refused, saying she would receive care at home. I prescribed medications and left instructions with the household staff, but I fear it may not be enough. January 16th, 1914. Clara Harrison died yesterday. I was not present when she passed. Her husband called for another physician, Dr. Whitmore, who is known to be more accommodating to the preferences of wealthy families. I learned of her death this morning, and it has affected me profoundly. I signed no death certificate, made no examination of her body, was not consulted about the final days of her illness. Dr. Whitmore listed the cause of death as pneumonia, with complications due to general debility. This may be medically accurate in the narrowest sense, but it obscures the deeper truth. Clara Harrison was killed by her husband as surely as if he had struck the final blow himself. 2 years of violence, terror, and abuse destroyed her spirit, weakened her body, and left her unable to fight off an infection that a healthy young woman should have survived. I believe she simply gave up, had no strength left to keep fighting. Robert Harrison has committed murder and will face no consequences. He will be viewed as a tragic widower, will receive society's sympathy, and will likely remarry within a year or two. Emily sat back from her computer, tears running down her face as she absorbed the full tragedy documented in Dr. Sterling's words. Emily knew immediately that Clara Harrison's story needed to be told, that the wedding photograph with its terrible hidden evidence needed to be understood not as a curious historical artifact, but as documentation of a young woman's suffering, and a window into the realities of domestic violence, in an era when women had few legal rights and little social power to escape abusive marriages. She spent the next month compiling all her research, the wedding photograph with detailed analysis of the visible injuries, the newspaper articles documenting Clara's accidents, the hospital records showing the pattern of violence, Dr. Sterling's journal entries revealing what physicians knew but felt powerless to address, and the final death certificate that obscured the true cause of Clara's death. In June 2024, the Philadelphia Museum of History opened a major exhibition titled Silent Suffering Domestic Violence in Gilded Age, Philadelphia. The centerpiece was the wedding photograph, displayed with detailed annotations pointing out the bruises on Clara's wrists, the tension in her posture, the fear in her eyes, all the things that had been invisible to casual viewers but which told a powerful story once you knew what to look for. The exhibition included Clara's full story, presented with compassion and historical context about the legal and social conditions that left women trapped in abusive marriages during that era. It explained that married women in 1912 had limited legal rights, that divorce was extremely difficult to obtain and carried enormous social stigma, that domestic violence was considered a private family matter rather than a crime, and that women from wealthy families often faced even more barriers to escape, because maintaining the family's reputation took precedence over individual safety. The exhibition drew enormous crowds and extensive media coverage. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran a feature article, "The Wedding Photo That Revealed a Century-Old Tragedy." National news outlets picked up the story. Domestic violence organizations used Clara's story in their educational materials, pointing out that the dynamics of abuse, the isolation, the control, the escalating violence, the victim's inability to escape, remain remarkably similar across the century that has passed since Clara's death. Emily was contacted by a woman named Rebecca Harrison Chen, who identified herself as a descendant of Robert Harrison's brother. "I want you to know that our family has discussed this exhibition extensively," Rebecca wrote in her email. "My great-great-grandfather was James Harrison, Robert's younger brother, one of the groomsmen in that wedding photograph. Family stories passed down through generations always portrayed Robert as a difficult, violent man. My great-grandfather apparently tried to intervene on Clara's behalf at least once, confronting his brother about the way he treated his wife, but was told to mind his own business. The family knew what was happening but felt powerless to stop it. Some family members tried to help Clara, but the social conventions of that era, combined with Robert's wealth and power, made intervention nearly impossible. Thank you for telling Clara's story truthfully and for giving her the recognition she deserved. She was a victim who has been forgotten by history for too long." Emily also heard from domestic violence advocates who pointed out the continuing relevance of Clara's story. The dynamics we see in this 1912 case, the isolation of the victim, the abuser's use of social status and economic power to control his wife, the community's unwillingness to intervene, the medical system's failure to protect her, these patterns still exist today, wrote Maria Torres, director of a Philadelphia area domestic violence shelter. Clara's story reminds us that this is not a new problem and that we must continue working to ensure that women today have the legal protections, social support, and resources to escape that Clara Harrison never had. The wedding photograph itself became an iconic image in discussions of historical domestic violence and the hidden stories that archival photographs can tell. Emily published an academic paper analyzing the image and arguing for the importance of looking beyond the surface of historical photographs to understand the human stories and social realities they document. Standing before the exhibition on its opening day, Emily looked at Clara's face in that wedding photograph, the young woman's eyes showing fear and resignation on what should have been one of the happiest days of her life. The bruises on her wrists, once invisible, now told their story clearly to thousands of visitors. Clara Bennett Harrison, dead at 21, finally had her truth acknowledged. The photograph her abuser had commissioned to document his possession of a beautiful young bride had become, instead, a testament to her suffering and a powerful reminder of the ongoing struggle against domestic violence. After 112 years of silence, Clara's story was finally being heard.